The Committee on Foreign Affairs will come to order. Purpose of this hearing is to discuss the State Department's FY 2024 budget request and explore the myriad of challenges facing the United States and its diplomats around the globe. I now recognize myself for an opening statement. Mr. Secretary, welcome. And we have no shortage of crises around the world for sure. And there's a lot to talk about. I believe that we are in a very dangerous period in history, the likes of which we have not seen since my father's war of World War II. After the debacle and the fall of Afghanistan, we had a hearing on that. We saw our adversaries respond. We saw weakness, and we projected weakness, not strength. History proves when you project strength, you get peace, but when you project weakness, it does invite aggression and war. You only need to look back to Neville Chamberlain and Hitler, and really the course of time has proven that axiom. So I think we need to start projecting more strength and deterrence. We saw not too long after the fall of Afghanistan on satellite imagery, the Russian Federation moving towards Ukraine. It was never a question of if, it was a question of when with Mr. Putin. And I think from what he saw, he decided it was the time. And we saw the troop presence, and then we saw the invasion. And then we see Chairman Xi. Chairman Xi is threatening Taiwan as we speak. They both met just recently, as you know, in Moscow. I know you met with the foreign minister of China when you were at the Munich Security Conference right after the spy balloon went over the United States, filming some of our most sensitive military nuclear sites. So this is an intense time, and we're starting to see this alliance not very similar in my judgment to what we saw in World War II. It's Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea. Now Mr. Putin is begging Iran for weapons. He has the Iranian drones in Crimea. I want to get the weapons in there to take out those Iranian drones, but they don't have them because you won't give them to them. The longer range artillery to win. I don't want to see him bleed over the winter and spring. I want to see victory, not a drawn-out conflict that has no resolution in sight. The threat of communist China cannot be overstated. They are the number one threat to long-term to our national security. It's why I introduced and passed the CHIPS Act to pull the supply chain of semiconductors out of Taiwan and China and make them here in the United States. But still, 90% of that advanced semiconductor manufacturing takes place in Taiwan. So when people ask, why is Taiwan important? Imagine if China invaded Taiwan tomorrow and controlled 90% of the global supply. We would be in a world of hurt. I personally think Chairman Xi is going to try to influence the election. If he fails, then I think Plan B will be a blockade and an invasion that will be on a scale that will make Ukraine look like a very small thing. A massive cyber attack. Taiwan is not prepared. We have no joint military exercises. The weapons I signed off on 3 years ago have yet to go into country. I don't understand why this takes so long. And if we don't have the deterrence, like we didn't have the deterrence with Ukraine, I called for sanctions and weapons before the invasion. I think we should be doing the same thing with Taiwan. We need to arm them and prepare them to provide deterrence along with AUKUS and the Quad to deter the Chinese from an invasion, which I think, again, would be devastating. Iran is at 85% enrichment. You know, the bombs dropped in Hiroshima and Nagasaki had 80% enrichment. They're already there, Mr. Secretary. 90%, they say, is weapons grade. What are we doing to stop this? And are we giving the Iranians a strong message that a nuclear Iran is not acceptable? We're seeing China come into the Middle East and negotiate agreements between Saudis and Iran. I haven't seen the Abraham Accords expanded at all under your tenure. But we have to make it clear to them what a nuclear Iran would mean, and we have to support Israel in that fight. Meanwhile, our president rescinded the migrant protection protocols, remained in Mexico that the State Department was involved in, which opened our borders up into a wide open invasion from the cartels that now even your own Border Patrol admit have operational control of the border. That's my home state of Texas. I've been dealing with this issue as a federal prosecutor to chairman of Homeland, and now witnessing what I'm seeing is the worst I've ever seen. You and I have talked about fentanyls, and I applaud your efforts to talk to the leadership in China about the precursors coming from China into Mexico that have killed 100,000 young people in this country just over the last year. To put that in perspective, that's more than who died in the Vietnam War. And it's an attack on our young people. So, Mr. Secretary, my time's limited. There's so many things I could talk about that I don't have time. But right now, you are in a very important position in a very important time in history. And the parallels to 1939, when I go to Poland, they say it's Hitler invading Poland all over again. They see it that way. They have Auschwitz in their backyard. They remember the war crimes, as we see war crimes taking place in Ukraine. As I went to Bucha, as you know, to see the mass grave sites, and went to Kyiv to meet with President Zelensky, and I will be going to Asia. Those two threats, the European theater and Pacific that my father's generation liberated from tyranny in strong support of freedom and democracy, are now at risk, at threat. Now they want to change the maps from what the greatest generation liberated. We cannot allow that to happen, sir. I want to work with you. We're all Americans. And I believe most members on this committee agree with that assessment. But I do have to point out my concerns, and I think the weaknesses, and we'll have more time to discuss that in our questioning. I want to just close with this, though. We had a Marine Sergeant, Vargas Andrews, testified before this committee that he had the suicide bomber in his sights before the bomb went off. He met with his team. He met with his intelligence team. An intelligence bulletin went out describing the suicide bomber. They got the identification. They got the PSYOPs. They pushed it up the chain of command, and the response was, I do not have authority to give you permission to engage against the threat. And the question was asked, well, who has the authority? I don't know. I'll have to get back to you. And guess what? Nobody got back to him. And then guess what? Just hours later, the bomb went off, killing 13 servicemen and women, 140 Afghanistans, and injuring 50, including Major Sergeant Andrews Vargas, who lost his limb, his leg, who had 40 surgeries. We have the mother of the woman, the Marine Sergeant, who was killed in that deadly blast. And I'll never forget giving her a hug, and she said, I'm devastated to know that this tragedy could have been prevented and my daughter could still be alive today, but for the negligence of what happened in Afghanistan that day, and I want to recognize her. Christy Shamblin, the mother of Marine Sergeant Nicole G., who was killed at Abbey Gate. She is in this room today. And let me just say to her and all the veterans of that conflict, you did not get wounded in vain. You did not die in vain. What you did was worth it because you protected America for 20 years from attacks. And I would ask that Christy Shamblin, if you could stand so you can be recognized. Now, I was told she was going to be here. There she is. Let me just close by saying, I will not rest, Christy, until we get answers, until people are held accountable for what happened to your daughter and the other servicemen and women and the Afghans. I will not rest until we get answers. And we will, if we have to go all the way up the chain of command to do it. With that, I now recognize the ranking member, Mr. Meeks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me begin by thanking Secretary Blinken for appearing before the committee today to discuss the Biden administration's proposed international affairs budget for fiscal year 2024. Let me also thank you, Mr. Secretary, for we are the House Foreign Affairs Committee, for your focus on diplomacy. That's what this committee is all about. The HASC, the Arms Committee, deals with defense and DOD. And we know the significance and importance of diplomacy going alongside the Defense Department, with the Defense Department. And what the State Department and what we're here to discuss today has to deal with the responsibility that the Department of State has. And I am extremely glad to see that the administration's budget request prioritize diplomacy and development, ensuring that we have the tools necessary to lead on the global stage and leverage the United States' soft power, which better positions the United States to address global challenges, deepen our alliances, and advance our U.S. interests. Fact of the matter, Mr. Secretary, had not President Biden led, when we talk about particularly the Ukraine, led by having our allies join with us, if we had jumped out there by ourselves, Putin would have been right. We would have been divided. NATO would not be strong. The EU would not be where it is, all working collectively together to fight back the aggression of Vladimir Putin and Russia. It is that unity is what put us there where we are today with Ukraine, which at the time no one thought we would be here a year later with Ukraine still standing. But it is the leadership and the strength that the Biden administration showed in holding our allies together that we're able to say that we're going to stay and continue to give Ukrainians what they need until they win. And we're not going to make any decisions without the Ukrainians. And I think that is what is extremely important, to make sure that we follow that model even as we deal with China, which is why I do think that the chairman's trip to South Korea, to Japan and Taiwan, similar to the trip that I did along with former Speaker Nancy Pelosi last year, is important, because we can't just say we're going to go at China by ourselves. We need our allies and alliances together in the Indo-Pacific, in Europe, in Africa, in Central and South America, in fact, indeed, around the world. It has to be America leading other nations and not America alone. If you're leading, you have to lead somebody. And bringing our folks together is what you do at the State Department and the men and women of the State Department who do a job every day. In fact, I say they are unheralded heroes and sheroes that we sometimes forget about. So it is vital to our national security for the State Department to be adequately funded. It is also incumbent upon Congress to regularly pass authorization legislation for the State Department so that we can ensure that our diplomats have the tools they need to advance American interests around the world. You know, under my chairmanship in the last Congress, I've worked on a bipartisan basis to accomplish this, passing State Department authorization bills into law in both 2021 and 2022. It was the first time in nearly 2 decades that such bills became law. And I know in working with Chairman McCall, we can continue that bipartisan work and make a state authorization as routine as the must-pass NDAA is. And I hope we can make similar progress on authorizing foreign assistance and the U.S. Agency for International Development. I don't see moving these types of bills as optional or as favors to the Department of, or USAID. Rather, it's core to our job as authorizers. In discussions surrounding the budget, I must admit that I am concerned by some of the extreme proposals emanating from the other side of the aisle that, if implemented, would threaten the United States' capacity to carry out bold diplomacy and the development work that has impacted so many lives. The across-the-board cuts that I hear coming from my colleagues on the other side of the aisle are arbitrary and counter to our most serious needs. Some of the same extreme voices who claim in one breath that the Biden administration is not doing enough to counter China will in another breath advocate cutting the diplomatic and development budget necessary to outcompete China. Which is it? As President Biden famously said, "Don't tell me what you value, show me your budget, and I'll tell you what you value." If my colleagues truly want to address the rise of China, not to mention many other complex global challenges, cutting our diplomatic capacity and the funding of programs that strengthen American soft power is exactly the wrong way to do it. You know, China has surpassed the United States in the number of diplomatic posts worldwide to 280 posts compared to our 275. And from 2013 to 2018, China doubled its diplomacy budget. Moreover, this debate can't focus only on China. The United States must broaden our diplomatic footprint and expand our geopolitical presence and influence. Our relationships around the world will be pivotal to meeting the global challenges we face, whether it is Putin's renewed aggression in Ukraine, the root causes of migration in Central and South America, the existential threat of climate change, pandemics, democratic backsliding, or human rights abuses around the world. This committee has to consider all of that. That is our jurisdiction. The United States has a great role to play in shaping the world we want to live in. And we should utilize every opportunity to build coalitions of allies and partners who share our democratic values. That's who we are. If we once again adapt an America alone or America only foreign policy, our competitors and adversaries will fill that void. We're just opening it up for China or Russia. We have a choice to make, and this committee should make clear where it stands. Do we want to strengthen American global leadership, or are we going to allow the extreme wing of the party of the Republican Party to weaken our national security. Our State Department is vital to our national security. It makes Americans more secure and advances a more prosperous and stable world. That is why ensuring the department has the funding it needs is so crucial. And I hope we can work in a bipartisan manner to not only give our diplomats the tools they need to succeed, but ensure the best individuals are being hired and promoted at state to represent our great nation around the world. So, I say that, Mr. Secretary, as you know, one of my top priorities has been to address inequities and disparities in career progression for officers belonging to historically excluded groups at the department. And I am happy, I'm glad to see the steps that have been taken to address this issue, but I know we can even do more. And I hope the department will continue to make progress on improving equity and diversity within the institution. On that note, let me thank you personally for the decision you announced yesterday to end the department's practice of issuing assignment restrictions as a condition on granting security clearances. Many of us have been concerned for a decade about this unnecessary practice, which has caused harm to the careers of many employees simply because of their racial, ethnic, or national origin. This was the right decision, and I commend you for that. So, Secretary Blinken, let me again thank you for being here, and I look forward to hearing your testimony and answers to what I know will be thoughtful questions from our members. And let me lastly say to all that are here, and particularly those who have lost their lives in Afghanistan, those during the evacuation and for the 20 years. I would hope that this committee will look at the entire 20 years. The entire 20 years, so that we can look and learn and make sure mistakes that we have made, we correct them. Make sure that there's not one life of an American soldier and our allies, because none of them, and I agree with the chairman on this, there's not a single life that was lost in vain. We thank the men and women of our services and those who served in Afghanistan for their bravery, for standing, and for fighting for the interests of the United States of America. We will never, ever forget them. We will make sure that we work collectively together, and I think this is one area that, you know, we have several veterans still on our committee. There's no greater service to our country than those that put their lives on the line to defend our country. And we should never, ever, ever forget those and the families that have lost their loved ones in the line of duty in supporting the United States of America. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.